All right, welcome back to the Debrief Podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined by News Director Ted Baker. We're talking cryptocurrency, landfills, supply chain issues, and of course, COVID-19, because we can't stop talking about COVID-19. But before we get into that, a little programming note for those who've been following along. Next week is the 6-year anniversary of the Debrief Podcast. To celebrate, Jackie Augustine, who co-created the show, is going to be back in studio. The three of us are going to be back together. It's been, I want to say, close to a year since all three of us, Ted, have been in studio, so that's going to be pretty awesome. We'll throw up all the promo stuff later this week, so that is that. So let's get into the stories this week. Of course, a little bit of breaking news since last night. After a 2+ year fight, Seneca Meadows has a local operating permit in Seneca Falls. The Seneca Falls Town Board voted 4-1 on that, which in my view seems to pave the way for the DEC to extend its permit, which obviously Seneca Meadows is going after right now. The question here, I guess, is does this change anything long-term for Seneca Falls, the dynamic involving the landfill, and then obviously, which a lot of people are probably curious about, does that mean a landfill is almost guaranteed to be in Seneca Falls for the next 20 to 30 years?
It does mean that, and I don't think there was ever any question, frankly. I think that as long as they wanted to operate, they were going to be allowed to operate. So in the long term, business goes on as always, and we have contentious elections every couple of years in Seneca Falls.
Yeah, and it doesn't really seem to change. I guess there was a little bit of, I don't want to call it hope, but I think some people thought that because the town board didn't act on this last month when they had the opportunity to, even though it had appeared the change or the victories and losses that had played out last November paved the way for an instant decision to be made, that maybe because of that 30-day delay from the January meeting to last night's meeting, that the outcome might be a little different, or that this board might be thinking about it. That appears to be obviously off the table. It's interesting to me because I think this is one scenario in which it creates a little more certainty. Before we had the debate and this permit, you can go back all the way to Supervisor Lazaro's term as town supervisor, 4 or 5 years. This permit has always kind of been the thing that is being debated. With that gone, I'm not really sure there's too much uncertainty about what's going to happen over the next several years. Obviously, does Local Law 3 stand up? That's going to be another question that kind of gets attention moving forward. A couple people asked early this morning after we posted Julie Coleman's story about last night's meeting if this guaranteed operation through 2040, because that's the date that has been discussed in terms of what Seneca Meadows has space currently to operate in. I think the answer is yes. You feel any differently about that part of it now that this has happened, or maybe beyond 2040 at this point?
I think as long as they want to be in business and as long as they have room to do it, I think they will be. The question for me always about these things, I've been in New York now almost 20 years, and I still don't understand government in New York and how broken it is. Why this ultimately, the town board can talk about this all they want. Ultimately, the state decides. It's the DEC, and they're taking lots of trash from downstate. I'm sure there are people downstate with lots of money who say we want to keep shipping our trash up to the middle of nowhere in the Finger Lakes and make it happen. And so it happens. It's a little bit odd to me how difficult it is in New York for local communities to do anything unless the state also agrees with it.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen closure of some smaller landfills around the state. I think of like the Auburn landfill, but at the end of the day, I think this is a little different because of its size. And what does shutting down a Seneca Meadows, one of the largest landfills, period, what does that entail compared to shutting down, say, smaller landfills? And I think that's, in terms of how I think the state is approaching it, is pretty much with that question in mind.
Right.
Can we shut down smaller landfills and limit the number of landfills that operate in the state and keep our larger landfills running. And unfortunately, I think
where's New York City going to send their trash? If there's no Seneca Meadows, where is all that trash? Staten Island's pretty full.
Yeah, and, full disclosure on that one, too. I mean, there are plenty of states outside of New York that are sending municipal solid waste to Seneca Meadows. I mean, New York City is a bigger contributor, but it's not the only big contributor, and it's not the only contributor that's, sort of outside of the upstate region. Another Seneca Falls issue that finally was resolved last night after, I think, also about 2 years of debate. The Seneca Falls Town Board voted 3-2 to establish a town manager position. This person will effectively be the day-to-day operator of the municipality. Think the way most cities are run, with a city manager, city council, or in this case, the town board, gives the marching orders to the administrator or the town manager, and then that person carries out those duties over the next 28 days. Works on paper, and I think it's probably an overall positive for Seneca Falls, given some of the administrative issues that they've dealt with since 2015, 2016. But the question I really think that a lot of people in the community will ask is, does a municipality of this size need a town manager? And that really is the question.
Absolutely. I looked it up. The town budget, I think it was the most recent one, was something in the neighborhood of $3.8 million. If you had a $3.8 million business, would you want it run by a rotating cast of essentially volunteers who are subject to election or non-election every couple of years? Or do you want the continuity of someone who's got experience and all that kind of thing? I mean, it's anybody, you've covered board meetings, as have I. Sometimes you need a dictionary to understand what they're talking about. I mean, this is complicated stuff. And so not only from the professional expertise point of view, but the continuity point of view.
That's huge.
So that you've got somebody who's going to be there all the way through, who is not completely not subject to political pressure, but is less subject to political pressure than, we talked about it a lot on this program, that the complexity of government is getting to the point where it's getting beyond our well-meaning but limited board people. I mean, most of the people that are on town boards don't have any real huge background in all of this stuff. So I think, yes, they do, and I think it's a good move.
Yeah, and I think the other part of that, too, is I understand that, like you said, a lot of public servants go in with the right intentions. But like you said, really complicated stuff, really complex issues that predate, often case, what their time in office. But then also you've got the 30, municipal government is running every single day. And who says that every elected official can give 30 days of, oversight to this thing? And yes, shared responsibility, I understand. But at the end of the day, when you have elected officials who aren't held to a quote unquote 40-hour standard, or even just the basic standards of which you can hold an employee, it just creates a very different situation for, when things get missed or when something goes wrong. It's very easy to say, well, geez, look, he was just a part-time elected official. I mean, come on, what's he supposed to do?
Well, and in Seneca Falls specifically, let's remember these board members aren't running on a platform of, I'll take care of your money, I'll be a good steward, I'll be a good manager. They're running on a platform of, I like Seneca Meadows or I don't like Seneca Meadows. I mean, so you have people that are campaigning on a whole different issue. Then, I mean, that's obviously part of the job, but the bigger part of it's that day-to-day management. So I think ultimately the town and a lot of towns, even smaller ones, would probably be better served by getting that professional management.
Villages had administrators. That's my argument. I mean, you have the smallest, most local version of government imaginable, and throughout most of their existences before they started dissolving, they all had administrators. And there was a reason for that, because you need someone who can, depending on size of the municipality, you're talking, like you said, multi-million-dollar budgets. I mean, to think that there are towns, let's say in the Finger Lakes, that have budgets that exceed 5-10 million and still don't have a full-time dedicated town manager is kind of insane if you really just think about it in terms of what could potentially go wrong.
My hometown of Rushville, population 600, I mean, when a new mayor is elected, he's going to come in with great intentions, but again, not a lot of training, not a lot of background in how things have been done, and I mean, it takes a while to get up to speed. So I think having somebody, and especially having somebody, again, not completely outside of the political process, but at least somewhat outside, is a plus in these cases.
And also, I'll say, for sake of some of that political pressure that you talked about, a dedicated manager or a dedicated administrator is going to be less apt to lean into the, well, that's the way we've always done it mantra, which is probably the biggest thing outside of just pure political pressure and kind of the divisiveness of politics at times that contributes to how municipalities, big or small, get a little stuck in the mud. So anything that you can do to kind of like shake that up and kind of have creative energy behind what's happening in a municipality is a great idea. Gubernatorial candidate Jumaane Williams was in the Finger Lakes this week calling for an end to cryptocurrency mining. Advocates are calling for a moratorium, largely because of the alleged environmental impacts of the Greenwich facility down in Dresden. Question, of course, outcome aside, since I think this is another one that's going to be largely decided in Albany without local input for that regard. How has coverage been of this issue? Because you and I were just talking the other day in the newsroom about how our reporters are approaching this and what they should or shouldn't be doing, how some of the press releases, when you're dealing with a really complex issue like this, become a little more advocate-y and a little less objective in terms of just being a pure announcement. So what do you think has been on the good side and the bad side of coverage, not just here, but across the Finger Lakes?
Well, we were talking about, we get press releases, news releases from places like Greenwich and from Seneca Meadows for that matter, highlighting their charitable donations, or in the case of Greenwich, we just got one saying that they'd be paying more in taxes this year. And so the question is always, is that legitimate news or is that promotion for these controversial places? And it's a little bit of both. I guess I might be in a minority here. I guess I don't understand the whole opposition to cryptocurrency. Greenwich is a power plant. They generate electricity. If we didn't have Bitcoin, we'd still be generating electricity, maybe not specifically at this plant. And for some reason, it just seems like this specific purpose angers people. I think a lot of it, frankly, I don't think many people understand cryptocurrency. I've begun to get sort of a basic grasp of it. So, I mean, to me, power plants are going to generate power. That's what they're there for. Why do we care if Greenwich is generating electricity to run electric cars or our heater when it gets down to zero or to do Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think that the bigger issue is the intensity at which the facility has to run and the impact that has on nearby Seneca Lake. And, you know, from the coverage standpoint, my biggest issue is, you know, everybody runs these press releases. Everybody does, whether you're the weekly newspaper, whether you're the daily newspaper, whether you're one of the television stations in Rochester, Omai, or Syracuse, daily newspapers in like Ithaca. Everybody is running this content. And it seems to me that you either have to have an all or none approach if you're going to do it objectively. And then on top of that, if the goal is to not see the opposition in the news at all, then you're making an argument from a failed point of view. You're trying to convince editors to not run something that is, and we had this issue play out. My point is this: I don't think anyone's really been covering the Greenwich issue very well outside of us. Thanks to Peter Mantius, we have probably the best coverage, critical coverage of Greenwich 2 years running-ish. And I don't think that it makes a huge difference, again, one way or another, how we frame individual stories or what is happening in kind of like the day-to-day of coverage of this issue, because, again, Albany is going to make the decision, and Albany doesn't care what Finger Lakes 1 runs, just like they don't care what the newspapers run or what any of the TV stations in any of the markets say either. They're going to make a decision that's based on what the state of New York needs. And the fate of this moratorium rests largely on whether, the Democrats in Albany can get behind it. So this is kind of one of those scenarios where the rest of New York State is kind of at the mercy of Albany, and it doesn't really go further than that, I don't think.
And in terms of media coverage, there are a couple of things in play here. One is there are many people who are convinced to their core that we in the media have a stake in the outcome of certain issues. If we run a story that says anything nice about Greenwich, it means we're in the tank, we're in their pocket, we want, and spoiler alert, we don't. For the most part, I don't live anywhere near there. I don't especially care whether they make Bitcoin or not. I don't think I'll probably ever have one. That's the first thing. And then the other thing with an issue like this is the Greenwich folks won't talk. They'll send us news releases saying we did nice thing, we gave money to the Girl Scouts, we're paying more taxes. But other than that, they don't want to engage because they see it in their best interests. The less that is said about this issue, the happier they are. So we get the environmental people who want to talk, and so then people say, well, you're a greenie. Right. So, if we can only report on what we can report on, if a side of a contentious issue doesn't want to talk to us, then there's a good chance you're going to see more from the other side. That's just the way it works. And the other thing is there are people who believe that if they don't talk to you, you can't do the story because we have to be fair. So if I don't talk to you, you can't talk to the other side. And no, that's not how it works either.
Well, and I also think and this is kind of a bigger themed thing, and we'll get into it more in another episode, but I think there's this misconception about the impact of journalism. Like there's this idea that if a journalist spends months working on this deep rooted story, and it's like 3,000 words long, and it's hard hitting, and it really shows how this company is bad, that it's going to somehow change public opinion, or it's going to somehow change the outcome. And the reality, whether you call it unfortunate or fortunate, is that just isn't how it works. People's attention spans are shorter than ever, and just as the case are the people who criticize when we run a Greenwich press release, or the opposite. The attention span is it's
right.
not there. It's
20
short.
minutes later, there's a Free Britney story, and we've moved on.
And you can't change that. Like you can't take that out of journalism now. So in my mind, I think if asking me like what good coverage looks like, I think good coverage is that continued, shorter, stay on it, keep it in the forefront, so to speak. And that is where the responsibility lies with an organization like ours, or frankly, any organization at all that's sharing news. Let's get into some of the interviews that you've done this week, because you have had some awesome interviews in the last week and a half. First up was some stuff about supply chain. Obviously, everybody's been going to the grocery store and they're seeing canned goods not around. They're seeing the diaper shelves empty, cars because of the chip shortage issues there. When you did the interview with the expert from Cornell, what were the issues at play? What's causing it? And I think the question that a lot of people asked afterward was, how soon does it end, or can it end?
Well, I talked with Arthur Wheaton from the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell. In the case of cars, for example, we have these computer chips that are now largely made in Taiwan. So if there's a shortage of those chips, we can make 99.9% of the car, but without that chip, we can't finish the car. That's an increasing thing in our society. A lot of the things that we buy are assembled from parts in all kinds of different places. So that's part of it. Some of it's the obvious things we've seen on the news. We've seen the container ships backed up on the West Coast. We've heard about the truck driver shortages in New York. They've made it so younger people can get their commercial driver's license. Third parties can now administer the test, so they're working on that. That's part of it. And part of it, I asked him, because I've always thought this myself, and I've said it on this program, that some of these shortages, a lot of the things being blamed on COVID right now are things that were taking place in society anyway, and COVID makes a convenient scapegoat. There's something that's called just-in-time inventory. It's practiced both by manufacturers and by retailers. In a perfect world, if I had Ted's store and I knew exactly what everyone was going to buy, I'd get that stuff shipped in overnight. People would come in, they'd buy it, my shelves would be empty, and I'd restock them again the next day. obviously you can't do that. But the more inventory you have to keep on hand and move around, the more expensive it is. So the idea of just-in-time inventory is, let's try to anticipate how many of these things people are going to buy today and make sure there's just that many on the shelf, and then when they run out, we'll replenish it. So that's a big part of it, is just that it's a more international world, and a lot of it is the offshoring of United States production. We used to make a lot of things here in America that we don't anymore, so now we rely on waiting for someone else to make them and waiting for the container ships to come over and dock at Long Beach.
End in sight?
What's that?
End in sight? Was there an idea of an end in sight, or is this something that will probably continue to play out to some degree over the next
I think
years?
It's going to continue for a while. I think that was the gist of it, because, again, even if COVID ends, we still have these chips being made in Taiwan and a backup of, all these items. I mean, everything we have, I'm sitting here with a laptop, you've got a tablet, we've got a screen over here. All these things have microprocessor chips in them.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be, it's part of that bigger issue I talk about all the time about the way we live changing, and we're going to have to maybe think about, do we want, and this will tie into something you're going to talk about in a little bit in terms of affordability and things. Are we willing to pay a little more to have more manufacturing back here on our shores, so we don't have to rely on things coming across the Pacific Ocean in boats?
Yeah. Let's talk about that now. Since you prefaced it pretty well there. I wrote a column last weekend, and I don't have the notes in front of me for that one, but the gist of it was this. I saw this criticism on Facebook of a development that I believe is happening at the Denny's property along 5 and 20 in the city, or outside of the city, I suppose, in Auburn. The criticism was essentially, we need to have a local restaurant open there whose prices are affordable. And it's interesting because I always say, and a lot of the other comments on that particular thread were themed around, oh, we need this chain, or oh, we need that chain, or oh, we need that. And it got me thinking, because there is this desire for local, but at the same time, this expectation that it also be affordable or compete with chain prices. And anybody, you can talk to anybody who runs a small business, 99 times out of 100, it's not possible. Why? Because the chain has a corporation behind it. The chain can write off a loss for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and they don't have to close. They don't have to do anything. Small business doesn't have that backing. The small business doesn't have that. It's a convenience, really. And when you kind of game this out, you think about, well, why do restaurants that are operated on the local side tend to only last a handful of years before they disappear or change ownership? Is exactly that. They're operating on very small margins, and they're susceptible to any kind of change in the market, whether it be COVID, whether it be just change in habit of customers, a couple bad reviews on social media. It's difficult, and it's interesting because I think consumers, if they want local, they need to get comfortable with spending more. And if that exposes another problem in our economy, then that's a separate thing, or a separate debate. But we can't have that debate and focus all of the attention on why is small business owner Bob's prices $2 higher than the mega chain that has 4,000 locations across the country.
Well, I think the first thing is, people say they want local businesses. They say that all the time. And how many times have we seen this? They lament the closing of local business X. Oh man, that's too bad. I love that place. Yeah, when's the last time you went? Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you want more of something, support it with your dollars. If you really want more local businesses, shop at more local businesses. Now, and the other thing is, restaurants are a little bit different from other businesses anyway. Restaurants chronically fail. I don't know, I've heard maybe 50% of new ones that open fail. I mean, think about it. If I want to open up Ted's restaurant, you probably 80% of your restaurant going is at 20% of the restaurants, the old 80-20 rule. I'm guessing most people don't go to a lot of different places. They have a handful of favorites.
Yeah.
So for me to succeed as a new restaurant, I have to somehow get all these people to change from going where they go now to come to my place. That's difficult to do.
And you've got the branding element involved too. How does a local restaurant or local business in general, even if you're selling clothing, we've seen some success stories. CV Designs or previously CV Designs in Seneca Falls is a great example of a local business that did well, has done really well on the branding side of it. But so many small businesses struggle to compete on the branding side with the chains, whether you're competing with a grocery store or whether you're competing with a department store or whatever the case may be. It's difficult, and even more difficult for restaurants because the chains, I guess unironically, the number one requested restaurant in that thread that I referenced in my column there was Chick-fil-A. So,
right. And here's why. I'm old enough. I've got a little bit of history here, and I think I can explain this. How did McDonald's get started? Here's how McDonald's got started. In the 1950s, we began to build the interstate highway system. That made it easier now to travel farther from home at faster speeds. Before that, if you wanted to cross New York, you had to go 5 and 20, and you had to go 30 through Geneva, and 30 through Waterloo, and 30 through Seneca Falls, and 30 through Auburn. It took you 3 hours to go 100 miles. Now suddenly America's all opened up. So you're out on the road and you stop at some local diner. Might be great, might be terrible. You don't know. Pre-internet, there's no way to tell. So along comes the McDonald brothers, who had a successful hamburger restaurant in Southern California, and someone said, you should franchise this. So now suddenly there's this standardization where anywhere in the country you see those arches, you know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
You know what's on the menu. That's what led to the chainification of America, was that standardized experience. I mean, and that's the other thing about restaurants. I'm sure we've all been through this. There's a new restaurant, you hear about it, you try it, you drop $50-$60 on dinner for you and your wife, and you don't like it. So do I want to risk my money trying places I don't like, or stay with the ones I do? So that's, I think the restaurant side is a little different from the rest of your piece, just because of the nature of restaurants. Frankly, we'd probably be better off if there were half as many restaurants in the world as there are. The ones that remain would thrive. And the other thing is, when people say there aren't affordable local restaurants, I don't really agree. I think there's all kinds.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I guess you have to define what you mean by affordable and what kind of restaurant. I mean, I'll go up to the McGee Diner right up the road here anytime and have breakfast at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's pretty affordable. You get out of there with like an $11 check. I mean, to me, that's affordable and local.
Yeah. So you had a series of, I believe was it 3 or 4 different conversations with health officials, health leaders throughout the Finger Lakes region. Obviously, talk about COVID response. For those who might have missed it, what were the big takeaways? And has it changed your view at all of how the region overall is responding to the pandemic?
A little bit. We reached out to 5 of the county health departments in our coverage area. 4 of them got back to us, and we talked to a total of 5 people from those 4 health departments. The first takeaway is, to me, how ready they were for this. They routinely go through drills for things like pandemics. It wasn't like this hit, oh my God, what are we going to do? They were ready for it. Another takeaway is just the absolute dedication of these people imagine, we've all had our world turned upside down a little bit. Who's had their world turned upside down more than anybody in any sort of health care or health education field? Suddenly now, this is what you deal with every day. I was talking with Sarah Christensen from Yates County. She said, there's some days I just leave the laptop at work, and I go home and I go, I'm not going to deal with it. The other thing was, I talked about the efficiency of some of these clinics. I don't know, you live in Monroe County, so you probably did most of your vaccination up there. Some of my family went through the drive-up Ontario County clinics at the highway garage. My son and I went to a booster clinic recently in Penn Yan, and these things are run like clockwork. You know where to drive, where to stand, where to park. The drive-through thing at the highway garage was just brilliant. You drive in, you roll down your left window, you stick out your left arm, you get the shot. They write a time 15 minutes later and put it on your windshield. You go park. When that time comes up, you're on your way home. I mean, it's just tremendous work for people that don't have huge staffs and suddenly had this weight of the world dumped on them.
I will say it was even impressive. I was vaccinated late last spring in Wayne County at the Lions Community Center, I believe it was. And that was, even then, it was very impressive to see it come together the way it clearly had. And at that point, these county sites had even less to work with. They were flying blind in a lot of ways. But now, a year later, they're doing impressive work.
I mean, they're better than I thought. That's probably the biggest takeaway overall, is these people do tremendous work under very difficult circumstances. And then we got into a little bit of the political part of it. In Seneca County, they approved a measure to block comments from their health department website if they choose, because of the ugly stuff. Cayuga County got into a whole thing about whether or not to enforce the mask mandate, which, of course, there was never really any enforcement with it anyway. So there's that side of it. That's got to be difficult. You know, you're health educators. You're telling people, here's this vaccine. It will help you. It's good. It works. And you have people berating you. That can't be a lot of fun. Although, of course, we in the media know a little bit about that.
Yeah, so let's talk about the Cayuga County situation that you just alluded to there. Obviously, mask mandate enforcement has been a big political football recently, and obviously you've got the legal side of things, the legal drama that's playing out with Governor Hochul's mandate, if you want to call it that, if it's not really being enforced at the state or local level. What was the consensus local take from those health officials on the mask mandate if it came up? How are they approaching it? And do you feel now like the mandate survives through until it expires, whenever that might happen, or do we see it fall before that?
I think mostly their opinion was they don't want to be mask police, right, but they want us to wear them. They said, get your vaccination, wear your mask, all the things, the basics. I mean, wash your hands, stay more than 6 feet apart if you can, do all those things until this goes away. And we really didn't get into the whole, what's going to happen with COVID. My feeling is, increasingly, I think it's going to become seasonal. I think by March, April, May, test results are going to be back to 0.1, but then next winter, when we get all crammed into our rooms and it's freezing cold, I think it comes back. So, but in a less, I think, serious form. I mean, increasingly, I don't think many of us see COVID as a life or death thing anymore. It is for some people, obviously. But for an increasing number of us, especially those who are vaccinated, if we do test positive, it's a pain in the butt for a couple of days and then life goes on. Did
any of the health officials that you spoke with give any insight as to what they think will play out in terms of that, in terms of what variants may end up, bubbling in the spring or summer or fall, or this may be a seasonal thing that we just have to deal with?
At the time we did the interviews, it was a couple of weeks ago, so we were beginning to see the national stories about Omicron trending down. Mm-hmm. Most of them said they hadn't seen it. I believe it was Sarah Christian from Yates County who was the last one I talked to, and she said they were beginning to see it.
Right.
So, I mean, that's kind of not so much their purview. I mean, they're busy running clinics and handing out masks and test kits and everything. But that's just kind of my feeling about it is, and I think you and I have talked about this a couple of times, I don't think it ever goes away. I don't think we go, that's it, COVID's done, it's 2023, party on. I think it comes back as on a par with the flu. Still has the ability to be much more dangerous than that, but I think that's what we're going to probably see. It would not surprise me. Last year in June or so, the average test percentage positive was in the 0.1%. I think we'll see that again, and then I think when winter comes along, we'll see 10, 15% again.
Yeah, and it's still pretty interesting to me that, and you can weigh in here too if you'd like, that there isn't a more concerted effort to ensure that our healthcare system is better prepared for these waves if we are going to continue. Because here's the thing that I'm thinking about. You're saying, well, okay, next winter we're going to be back in a scenario potentially where we have 10 to 15% of the population testing positive for whatever form of COVID is running wild at that point. Question is, can our current healthcare system, take the Finger Lakes as an example, can Thompson, Clifton Springs, and Geneva General, and throw in Soldiers and Sailors down in Penn Yan if you'd like, can those 4 hospitals handle whatever surge happens in terms of hospitalizations from flu and whatever COVID is around? And that's a question that I think should be getting more attention at the state and federal level, and it's just not, and it's not even really part of the discussion. I say it over and over again. Ontario County, population around 110,000, and there are around 90 ICU beds. Just bad math, period. And that is like the last thing that's being discussed. Even Governor Hochul's presumptive budget of the next fiscal year doesn't really do anything to address that issue. It kind of dances around putting more money in the hands of healthcare workers, which, hallelujah, let's do that. That's a good thing. But at the same time, no real meaningful infrastructure expansions of these healthcare facilities that were overwhelmed for the last 2+ years. Just makes no sense.
Well, the question is, can or should the state government compel private businesses to do things? I mean, some people say yes, some people say no. Frankly, and this is where I get a little contrarian, and my opinion falls out of the mainstream, I think the system has handled this wave better than most people think. I think the reporting has tended to highlight the failures. There are a couple of people in Rochester media who pretty much specialize in COVID scare stories. And, we keep hearing about diversions, how many times people couldn't get a hospital bed. To the best of my knowledge, it's in the double digits in a region with a population of 1 million. Now, that's double digits too many. I'm not saying that people, tough on you, you have to go to Albany to get a hospital bed. I'm not saying that's good. But in a region, what the state considers the Finger Lakes, which includes Monroe County, population roughly 1 million, this has happened 20 or 30 times.
Right.
That's not a lot of times in an area that big. And then how much of this, again, is COVID, and how much of it is all of the mergers and consolidations going on in the healthcare field? Do these companies want to hire more people? They would probably rather make profits. Well, I mean, technically they're nonprofit, but whatever. Make revenue, I guess, for lack of a better term. So I'm not sure exactly what the role of the state is here. Do we want more government? Do we want the state to begin saying to industries of its choice, you must hire more people, you must build more beds? And again, for a situation that may not come up, it's like I always make the analogy with utility companies. Should NYSEG or RG&E be forced to have 100 trucks parked somewhere for that one time every 5 years that they need them?
I would argue that if the one time that happens every 100 years, as it would be with this pandemic, if it's going to upend life for the following 3 to 5 years, which it seems that's the trajectory we are on, then yes.
Okay, and that's a very legitimate
because
point.
It just doesn't make sense for us to have been in this scenario where a hospital, and this is a non-local, maybe bad example for some folks who are listening. The analysis of, I can't recall which hospital it was in New York City that had fewer beds in 2020 when the pandemic was really going in full swing than it did in 1919 or 1920 during the Spanish flu. It just doesn't jive. Like, you can't, the population growth that's happened over the last 100 years is absurd. You can say technology's advanced. You can say that it's gotten easier to provide healthcare in different ways or in more streamlined ways, whatever the case may be. But even if for the quote-unquote nuclear option, you need to have something, you need to have a fail-safe in place. Because if the answer is, well, everybody's just going to have to deal with life being upended for a span of years, I mean, that's just a horrendous, that's an absurd
All right, that's a very good point. And then the follow-up question to that is, are you okay with your health insurance premiums going up 10 or 20%? Because that's what's going to happen if we force hospitals to hire more people and build more beds, it will cost us more money. We always come back to that question of what we want versus what we're willing to pay for.
Well, and it's interesting because I think that's when you start to get into a debate about whether healthcare and or medicine should be a for-profit venture, period.
Right.
And I think that's the big left-right divide, although I don't think I think that's more semantics than it is real principle. I don't think anybody wants to see people be left for dead because they do or don't have health insurance or can't afford health insurance. But that's kind of the reality we're in now. Like, yes, everything costs more money. But if we can have a better system that does cost 5, 10, 15, 20% more than the system that the average person is paying for present day, and that means that care is exponentially better and more complete, then yes, that is something we should be willing to pay for. And we could
do that. We could do that very easily. Here in the United States, we pay approximately 3 to 4 times for healthcare per person than almost every other developed nation on earth. But when President Obama tried to change the system a little bit, he was met with a tremendous amount of opposition. We can look to the way England does it, and France, and Germany, and Spain, and Belgium, and everybody else almost on earth does it better than we do and cheaper. But we're America, damn it, and we're not going to change.
And we don't. What's essential? So you talked with City Clerk Chuck Mason last week about action that City Council took regarding EMS workers and their classification as either an essential worker or not an essential worker, which I think is a state thing. They're basically calling on the state, right, to jump in and classify EMS workers as essential. What was going on there? What was the reason for it? And what prompted City Council to go that route?
Well, apparently New York is there's only about 10 or 11 states that don't have this designation, which is, I think, kind of a technicality. Basically, when they say essential, they say that means on the level of police and fire protection. I'm not 100% sure legally what that triggers in terms of benefits they can get. I mean, it's part of the same argument when we talk about volunteer fire departments in New York. They have a very hard time attracting and keeping people. There's a tremendous time commitment. There's a tremendous training and education commitment. So there have been some moves to do things like forgive a portion of their property tax or various financial incentives. I think it's kind of along the same things here, that these EMS workers have kind of a raw deal. They work hard, they train, they have to know all this stuff, and don't make very much money. I mean, it's you kind of wonder, we talked about professional management in town government, you know, should we be relying on volunteers to deliver all these essential services, or should we have paid fire departments and, you know, fully paid EMS people who are professionals?
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned fire departments, because I can recall having conversations with firefighters from a handful of different districts in Cayuga, Wayne, and Seneca County, and just kind of like talking about response time and how wildly it can vary based on who's available, based on what community you're in, based on a whole bunch of different factors that really boil down to the fact that these services are being provided by volunteers.
Yeah, what happens when a fire hits in August and 30% of the department's on vacation somewhere and they're out of town, you know, and so what happens if the bell rings and nobody shows up? You know,
you look at some of these rural, Cayuga and Wayne County are great examples in my mind of just some very rural places. And, you know, what happens when there's an emergency or a fire at the very edge of a district that doesn't have very uniform coverage? You know, what happens is response time suddenly 4 or 5, 6 minutes longer to there or to that address than it would be to another place. And that's kind of the question is, you know, the need, you know, how many fires or how many emergencies are they responding to versus the idea that maybe we should just be a little better organized in approaching these things and at least providing some level of continuity, level playing field across the board.
Yeah, it seems like it's getting harder to attract people to do these jobs. The same way we've talked about so many times, it's getting harder to find good qualified candidates to run for some of these positions that are technically part-time but wind up taking a lot of your time. And it's the same thing here. I mean, all these workers that provide very important services, and fewer people are willing to do it for the amount of money they get versus the time commitment. I mean, if you're a volunteer firefighter, you're kind of committing yourself to not necessarily be on call 24 hours a day, but as often as
Close
not
to
be on call 24 hours a day.
Yeah, I can recall, I can't remember which municipality it is in Monroe County, but in the last 6 or 8 months, there was a municipality that offered a tax break, tax incentive, property tax incentive to volunteer firefighters, I believe it was. And upon closer inspection, the savings was something like a couple $100 a year. And
Right.
it prompted this whole follow-up debate is like, well, that's a really nice thing to do on the surface, but that's not really any meaningful trade-off for being an on-call
Right.
firefighter 365 days a year.
Yeah,
at all.
I think we have to get a lot more serious about it than that. I mean, maybe it calls for a $5,000 a year stipend or something, or other financial incentives in terms of property tax breaks or education breaks for your kids or any of those sorts of things that makes it worth somebody's while to do this.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect of this too is like, as the quote unquote essentials of life become less and less attainable to the average person, especially the younger person, it will become more and more difficult to find the people who are willing to or have the wherewithal to donate their time to volunteer. It's a reality, and it isn't that much different for small businesses that are relying on part-time employees. We've had that conversation before on the show. It really comes down to how much time does a person have, and is that bargain worth exchanging in terms of, I only have 6 hours of free time a week. Do I want to spend 3 of them potentially doing firefighter trainings, getting called out to calls big and small, and whatever else might pop up in that 3-hour window? Or do I want to spend it with my family? Or do I want to use 3 or 4 of those hours to have a second job that pays me, $100 or $150 a week that I can use to support my family?
And I think increasingly young people are just saying, I don't have that time. I mean, on a smaller scale, we see that, the committees that run local events are very often stacked with people in their 60s and 70s, and they say, okay, I've done this enough. Who wants to step up and run the local festival? And crickets. No one wants to. It's because of the way I think things are changing, and people are spending their time differently, and they're saying, I can't commit to doing this, or I'm not willing to commit to doing it.
Well, and that's the number one thing I think that holds people back from participating in local government too, right? How many 20, 30, or 40-somethings, even 40-somethings, have the time or the personal capital while they're in their prime working years to give up, say it is only 20 hours a week, to be the town supervisor or be on town council or city council, whatever the case may be, in exchange for what they could be spending and using to provide for their family.
Right.
I mean,
absolutely.
It's a trade that really shouldn't exist. It's a trade-off that shouldn't really exist, but it does. And unfortunately, that's just the world we live in.
Yes, it is.
That's it. I think we did it.
So, all right. We're going to talk a little bit about what's coming up. We've got, let's see, I have my calendar right here to tell you. I'll be talking with Michael Mills from the Geneva Bid about the Winter Arts and Film Festival. They decided, talking about events, Geneva decided it needed a new winter event downtown, so they've put together this nice arts and film festival. We'll talk about that. I spoke recently with Sim Covington, who's the Chief Diversity Officer at FLCC, also the first black man elected to the Canandaigua City Council. I'll be publishing that today. Our weekly visit with Auburn City Clerk Chuck Mason tomorrow. We've got Ian Smith, the Seneca Lake steward, so we'll talk about HABs and water quality and everything on Seneca Lake. And Tuesday on Inside the FLX, our live edition, Chris Lavin with the Geneva Boys and Girls Clubs. We'll talk about everything he's doing and all the feeding operation. He's trained himself to become a food service expert. So that and whatever more we can schedule here. I'm having a lot of fun just going out and talking to interesting people, and we've got plenty of them.
And it'll keep on coming.
Sounds good.
All right, that's all for today. We will be back next week with another episode of the Debrief Podcast.